Early in the 16th century, Africa began to suffer the greatest calamity in its history, the steady and continuous arrival of Europeans. This was one of 43 castles built by 7 European nations along the coast of West Africa. They stand today as monuments to rivalry and greed. For the Europeans had discovered the wealth of the Americas, mining wealth and plantation wealth, and the way to get it by using slave labor. Unwilling to take slaves from Europe and unable to find enough in the New World, they turned to Africa. Horrible in its brutality and violence, the slave trade robbed Africa of millions of men and women, and even children. It spread cruelty and disaster. And yet, it was not only the enormous numbers that mattered. Every year for centuries, the trade removed from Africa tens of thousands of productive workers, of skilled workers, of men and women trained in tropical farming, in valuable crafts, and in many forms of enterprise. Today, the great Atlantic rollers have long lost their menace, and the forebears of these boys were among the lucky ones. But for millions before them, perhaps as many as 15 millions, this was the last they would ever see of their African homeland. Among the ship's captains there were tight packers and loose packers. Their purpose was the same, to enlarge their profits by landing as many slaves as possible alive in the New World. Sometimes captured far inland, the victims of black traders were driven to the dungeons of their white partners on the coast. There were protests, but they dwindled as the profits of the trade became ever more corrupting to kings and merchants in Africa as well as in Europe. It became normal and even necessary for white people to think of their black victims as less than human. Racism grew out of slavery. At Cape Coast, a chapel was built for the British garrison, right on top of the dungeons where, at any one time, up to 1,500 black captives awaited shipment. Not even the clergy spoke out against the trade, and some were ready to share in the pickings. Early in the 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade gradually began to come to an end. But even as the slavers withdrew, Europeans of a new kind began to penetrate deeply into the interior. These were the explorers. They had no warlike intentions. The guns they carried were for hunting and self-defense. It was seldom the fault of such men that the routes they opened up would all too soon be used by others with very different aims. Later generations of explorers would try for the North Pole or the South, or in our own day, the Moon. But for Mungo Park, Livingstone, Burton, and many others, Africa's legendary lakes and rivers were the great challenge. Above all else, they wanted to unlock the geographical mysteries of the continent. The strange thing about those remarkable men is that they really were only interested, with a few exceptions, in finding things, in gold, in ivory, in geographical information, in land to take. Almost never were they really interested in the humanity of Africa. The great exception was David Livingstone. For the inhabitants of Central Africa, surely the best-loved European ever to set foot in their country. A missionary who became an explorer, Livingstone traced the great Zambezi River from its far inland source to the Indian Ocean, hoping that if he could only prove it to be a navigable waterway, the whole of Central Africa could be opened up to the blessings of the gospel. In 1855, he became the first white man to see the Victoria Falls, soon to be accepted as one of the natural wonders of the world. But less dramatic obstacles further downstream barred the way to navigation. His specially constructed river steamer had to turn back. Today, Livingstone's statue stands overlooking the falls to which he gave a name. The inscription says that Dr. David Livingstone discovered the falls. That was in 1855. What happened, in fact, was that African friends of his, with whom he was living some days upstream from here, told him about this amazing sight in their country and brought him to see it. And Livingstone, whose generosity of heart never allowed him to forget what he owed to Africans, was careful to record this in his memoirs. But the people who put the statue up, long after, evidently thought that nothing really exists until a white man has found it. But news of such earthly wonders failed to impress his missionary paymasters in London. To them, Livingstone's journeys and geographical researches were a sign that he was neglecting his work for God. They wanted converts, not waterfalls. He, for his part, found their attitude to the splendors of Africa so narrow that he was driven to resign his membership of the London Missionary Society. His duty, he believed, was to respond to a wider vision. There were plenty of others to do ordinary work, and so indeed there were. A growing band of dedicated men and women came forward from many nations to carry the gospel into these heathen lands. This is the Mangwe Pass, an historic place in the story of the white man's penetration of southern Africa. To the southwest lay the deserts of the Kalahari, and beyond to the southeast, white-ruled South Africa. While back behind me, through the hills, the old trail ran north to Bulawayo, capital of the kingdom of the Matabele. Here ran the southern frontier of that kingdom, and this pass was the only point of entry allowed by the Matabele king to European missionaries, traders, or hunters. In their attitude to the Africans whom they'd come to convert, most of the missionaries would have been happy to echo the words of Livingstone himself.
We come among them as members of a superior race and servants of a government that desires to elevate the more degraded portions of the human family. We are adherents of a benign, holy religion, and may by consistent conduct and wise, patient efforts become the harbingers of peace to a hitherto distracted and downtrodden race.
A few thought otherwise. Here are the words of Bishop Tozer of the Universities Mission.
What do we mean when we say that England or France are civilized countries and the greater part of Africa is uncivilized? Surely the mere enjoyment of such things as railways and telegraphs do not necessarily prove their possessors to be in the first rank of civilized nations. Nothing can be so false as to suppose that the outward circumstance of a people is the measure either of its barbarism or its civilization.
Nevertheless, most missionaries believed that they alone could raise Africans out of their spiritual degradation. They faced many perils, not from being boiled in an African pot, which never happened, but from mortal fevers they could not cure. 6 out of 9 at Makalolo Mission, which Livingstone had founded, died in a single year. Willing converts were few. So it had to be asked, is force justified to save a man's soul? Flogging was used at some mission stations, others disapproved.
If it is agreed that an expedition cannot be carried out unless the leader of it commits day-by-day acts of brute violence, the reply is that missionary expeditions had better not be undertaken. If missions can only be worked by methods which no supporter of the mission would dare to state in detail on a mission platform, then missions had better not be undertaken.
But another and unquestioned requirement lay at the core of missionary labours. If the gospel message was to be accepted, the spiritual beliefs which formed the foundation of African community life had to be drained of their power and effectively destroyed. What the missionaries had come to do was to convince Africans that they must renounce their beliefs, forget their ancestors, and discard the very fabric of their culture. This missionary film, made as recently as the 1960s, makes the point very clearly.
As these women, whose lives have been spent in the dark shadow of fear, listen to the radiant young girls, they wonder at their joy and confidence. They remember the offerings they've so often made to the juju themselves, the sacrifices which have been of no use. I will tell you of a God who does not require our sacrifice. He made sacrifice for us. And she shows to these fear-ridden people the symbol of God's love. Sometimes the people seek out the missionary later. We have lost our faith in these jujus, they say. We want to destroy them and begin a new life. Some rejoice. Some wonder what will become of them now. Finally comes the great day when they gather for the baptism service. Students from the training college, girls from the primary school, men and women, one by one they go down into the waters of baptism so that they might be renewed in Christ.
A skeptic might find it hard to see why one form of spiritual renewal should be so superior to another. But to these missionaries, this was the indispensable climax to their endeavors. This is a Methodist school called Wadilav in modern Zimbabwe. It's an important day because the Minister of Information, Mr. Nathan Shamurira, himself an old boy of the school, is making a visit. The event brings into focus some of the underlying currents and contradictions of recent